Hello, my name's Nigel Osland of Workplace Unlimited, and this is a narration of a presentation I gave to the Facilities Management and Business Services Conference in Barcelona in June 2012. The presentation is on creating the productive workplace, but rather than present my usual productivity research, I wanted to give a more psychological perspective. As you can see, I'm a chartered psychologist, but my first question is, are there any other psychologists out there? And of course the answer is, we're all psychologists. On a daily basis, we all have to interact and communicate with other people, and to do that we need to understand their motivations and their innovation. So let's start with the basics, like what is productivity? Well, there are many definitions, but they all come down to this. Productivity is a ratio of output to input. Output is a product or service or even an idea, and it can be measured in terms of its quantity or its quality. In comparison, input is the time and effort we put into creating that output, and it may come down to staff costs or equipment costs or even workplace and facilities costs. So, if we can reduce the input, say the facilities cost, and maintain the output, that could be considered a gain in productivity. But what we're really after is an increase in output for less input. The chart shown here is often used in productivity presentations. It shows that property costs, including all the services, are typically only 10 to 20% of the overall cost to a business, whereas the main cost is that of salaries. In terms of the potential revenue generated by those staff, property costs are only around 3 to 6%. So we have to be careful when we're making savings in property that we're not affecting the performance of our key asset, the staff. The key is to measure productivity and certainly not to ignore it. In the business case for, say, a new workplace, we often focus on cost, but we ignore the productivity benefits. And the main reason for this given is that we simply can't measure productivity, whereas obviously we can easily measure cost. But there are many generic measures of productivity, and organisations such as ASHRAE, NEMA and CIBSE have documented them. The difficulty is in developing metrics specific to your own business, and this can be costly and timely and difficult. My personal advice is to use proxy measures such as satisfaction. The problem when trying to measure the impact of the workplace on productivity is that the really good measures of productivity, like profit and margin, are affected by numerous extraneous factors, including the economic market, marketing and advertising, not to mention organisational factors. At the other end of the spectrum, we can look at how the workplace impacts on individual performance tasks, such as proofreading. But unfortunately, these tasks have little relevance to business performance. So I want to briefly tell you about some research which will be published in July in the Journal of Building Survey, Appraisal and Valuation. And this was a literature review and meta-analysis of around 200 research studies. Out of these we selected 80 studies where specific performance metrics were reported. The problem with productivity research is that the range of outputs reported can vary from 0% to, I think in one case, 260%. And this is just unbelievable for finance directors and other people where you're trying to convince that we should account for productivity, say in a business case for a new workplace. So our aim was to come up with more credible figures. And what is unique to the study is that we looked at each paper and we then weighted the results in terms of how the environment that the study was conducted in, how it related to a real office. So for example, if the work was carried out in an actual office, it was weighted more highly than if it was carried out in a factory or a simulated office. We also weighted the way that the productivity was measured So for example, we gave a higher weighting to embedded business metrics and a lower weighting to measures such as self-assessment of performance. And we also weighted it in terms of the relevance to typical office activity. So for example, metrics such as absenteeism were related to actual time, working time spent in an office. And admin tasks such as proofreading would relate to an estimated time that kind of activity was carried out in an office. And then tasks on a PC, a computer, were related to time that we typically spend using a PC. And we used observation studies to enable us to determine typical time in activity in the office. Once we developed the ratings, we then tested them with expert groups like the Office Productivity Network, and also took on board their comments and readjusted the weightings. So, for example, one of the studies we looked at was carried out by Craig Knight and his colleagues at the University of Exeter. And Craig looked at 4 different types of office environment in simulated offices. So he looked at a space which had very little decoration, called the lean environment. He looked at an environment which was enriched by artwork, flowers and knickknacks on the desks. The next kind of environment he explored was when the staff were allowed to decorate the rooms as they wished. And the fourth one, the disempowered environment, was when staff were given the opportunity to decorate the space, but then someone came in and took all their decorations away. They included a range of metrics such as sorting tasks, vigilance tasks, and of course a questionnaire. And what they found is that when you looked at all the different metrics, the lean environment performed the worst, and the empowered environment performed the best. But also the disempowered environment probably scored worse than just a lean one. So in terms of our study, this research would have been weighted quite highly. It was an office simulation, but it was quite a realistic one, so we would have weighted that high. Good objective metrics were used, as well as the questionnaire, so that would also receive a high weighting. And also the tasks were mostly office related, so again in terms of the amount of time spent in that activity, it would have been high. So this table represents the results from our own research, our literature review and meta-analysis, and you can see the effect on performance of various environmental factors, lighting, noise and so on. You can see the unrated mean score for those factors, and you can see there's quite a range there. And then what we've also shown is the weighted increases in performance. So again, if you look at the means now, it's a much lower range from just over 1% to 3.5%. And we think that these weighted increases in performance are more realistic and certainly in line with productivity researchers' views that you would expect to see a 1 to 5% gain in productivity due to workplace and environmental conditions. And we believe that our weighted numbers could be included in a business case and be more acceptable to financial directors. This table shows the effects of single environmental factors, but we also found research to support how you might add multiple factors, and it conforms to a rule of diminishing returns. So the second factor you would add 2/3 of the value, and the third one perhaps 1/3 of the value. Anyhow, I was here to tell you about the impacts of psychology on performance. As you may be aware, psychology is the study of mental processes and human behaviour. But I also want to tell you a little bit about some environmental psychology studies. And environmental psychology focuses more on the interrelationship between people and their built environment. And finally, I want to tell you about research from a relatively new field of psychology, probably only about 60 years old, which is evolutionary psychology. And evolutionary psychologists are interested in how innate human behaviour and psychological processes have evolved for survival and well-being. Let's look at personality first. Persona is Latin for mask, so it's about the mask that we present to the world. And again, there's no agreed definition of personality, but my mashup is kind of written here. I think personality is an individual's unique set of traits and consistent pattern of thinking and behaviour that persists over time and across situations. So personality is not fixed as such, because we can adapt to different situations, i.e. we can conform to different groups, but it represents our proclivity for the way that we normally prefer to behave. This slide represents an attempt for me to show you how different personality theories have developed through time. Personality theories date back to the Egyptians, but it was probably the Greeks that first started to develop a theory. The four humours, or the four temperaments, were based on bodily fluids. So the Greeks believed that blood, black bile, yellow bile and phlegm all affected our personality. So phlegmatic obviously comes from the way that they would have viewed phlegm to influence our behaviour. Although basing personality on bodily fluids may for us sound a bit strange, interestingly neuropsychologists now think that personality is linked to neurotransmitters and other chemicals in the brain. So the chart shows that there are two main strands to personality theory. One set came out of the psychoanalytical theories of Jung and Freud, and that led to metrics that we're probably all familiar with, like the Myers-Briggs. And the second stream came out of trait theory, where thousands of different ways of describing our personality were put through factor analysis to develop initially Cattell's 16 personality factors, but later distilled even further down into what's called the Big Five personality factors, or OCEAN for short. So when I was at university, I was weaned on Ising's personality theory, his two super traits in particular. So one scale is the introversion to extroversion scale. Extroverts are thrill seekers, they like lots of stimulation, they like to socialise with people, they can be impulsive. The upshot of that is that they could become easily distracted when working alone. In contrast, the introverts, they prefer the quiet life, like to work alone, very reflective, like detail, like analysis, like to think things through, but they could be easily distracted by noise and commotion, particularly in an open plan environment. His other scale is around neuroticism, or emotional stability, going from stable to unstable. And the more neurotic or nervous people, they're going to want more planning. They're going to want a little bit more advance notice about things, whereas the calm, collected people are probably less bothered about impromptu meetings and not having information to hand and the like. Herman Miller asked me to look at the psychology of collaboration, in particular how personality affected how we collaborate. What we found is that although there's been quite a lot of research looking at the impact of personality on team working and team performance, there is very little exploring the connection to the workplace. The first thing we found is that there's actually a subtle difference between interaction and collaboration. Interaction is clearly exchanging knowledge two ways, but collaboration is more than that. It's about people working together to come up with something that they could not have achieved on their own. But the research also says that good collaboration is based on trust, and trust is gained by social interaction between people. So interaction is a precursor to collaboration, but they are slightly different. The other thing we found is that the best performing teams are made up of groups of different personalities. We originally thought that if we worked out the domineering personality of a team, we could then determine the right environment for that team to perform in. But the research shows that teams consisting of different personalities are slower to form initially, but once they do bond, they are likely to produce more creative and innovative output. So overall, they perform better. So this table is quite complicated, but it shows how the big 5 personality factors described by Ocean, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness and neuroticism, affect both performance and collaboration. We've already talked about extroverts. In terms of performance, they tend to be more imaginative and creative, but they can inhibit logic and detail. In terms of collaboration, extroverts, they prefer face-to-face meetings, impromptu meetings, informal meetings, and they probably prefer to meet in stimulating spaces like brainstorming rooms and other funky areas. In contrast, introverts are going to want planned and formal meetings. They're going to want information in advance. They're probably going to prefer to communicate through written documents, and in meetings they're certainly going to be quieter than the extroverts and probably be thinking things through before they actually voice their opinion. Similarly, conscientious people, they're going to want planned and formal, well-organised and minuted meetings, whereas the other end of the spectrum, disorganised, they're probably going to be more in favour of impromptu ad hoc meetings. Agreeableness is less about getting on with people, but more about whether you're challenging and questioning. So a disagreeable person in that respect will want to meet people and challenge them and have the opportunity to have their say on any documents or initiatives put forward. As you can see, more open people, they're good for creative tasks, but again may not be so good at the more routine tasks. And like extroverts, they would want more face-to-face meetings, more brainstormy type meetings, and meeting in new and stimulating places. And finally, neuroticism, or again emotional stability. A highly neurotic team is likely to be as effective as ones which have more emotional stability. And again, the more neurotic are going to want planned meetings. They're going to want advance notice. They're going to want to see information so that there's no surprises when they finally meet. So another meta theory in psychology is that of arousal theory. And arousal theory states that there's an inverted U-shaped relationship between the level of arousal and performance. People tend to perform better if they're stimulated, which increases their level of arousal. But too much stimulation can lead to stress and thus reduce performance, whereas too little stimulation results in low arousal, boredom, feelings of fatigue, and ultimately poor performance. So research shows that extroverts have a low level of arousal, which is why they're thrill seekers, whereas introverts have a natural high level of arousal. So again, the extroverts, they'll always be seeking stimulations through social interaction and the like, whereas the introverts, they would prefer to work alone, and they're much better at detailed analysis and work that requires dedication and so on. Another compounding factor is that the complexity of tasks increases arousal, whereas repetitive, detailed tasks decrease it, which again is why more repetitive and detailed tasks are suited to the introvert. Another example is noise and temperature. So, for example, noise can be quite stimulating, as can cold be. Certainly, if you're feeling tired, coldness can wake you up. But too much noise, and if it's too cold continuously, will eventually lead to stress and decreased performance. I want to just pick up on a few theories that have come out of the environmental psychology field. In his proxemic framework, All estimated the preferred distances between people interacting in different social contexts, and he actually found that the personal distance is considered to be about 1.2 meters, but the distances for social interaction or business are much higher. And an implication here is that we're seeing desk sizes becoming smaller, and people sitting nearer to each other, and in effect impinging on their personal space. Altman brought together a lot of theories on space into one model, the privacy model. And what Altman found is that privacy is a means of controlling our level of interaction with others. So depending on the task and our personality, we're going to want different levels of interaction at different times of the day and so on. Altman brought various theories on space together into one model, his privacy model. And he suggested that privacy is actually a means of controlling the level of interaction with others. And the amount of interaction we want will vary dependent on our personality and the task we're performing. And he suggested that if we, for example, have more privacy than we want, that would lead to feelings of isolation. Whereas in contrast, if we didn't get enough privacy, this could lead to stress. And he also found that personalisation or other forms of temporal behaviour are coping mechanisms. They're a means of controlling our interaction with others. The final theory I want to speak about from environmental psychology is that of sociofugal and sociopedal space. And this relates to how rooms are decorated and laid out and their location. And there's been various research showing that layout can affect how well people interact with each other. So sitting in circles leads to more eye contact and can be more inviting than sitting in rows, for example. More comfortable and better decorated environments are likely to be more attractive, i.e. sociopedal, compared to those with stark finishes and uncomfortable seating, like say a waiting room, which would be classed as sociofugal. Environmental psychologists also believe that the way we behave in a place is a function of both the environment and our personality. Our behaviour in a place is affected by our experiences and the expectations of a place as much as it is by the physical aspects. So behavioural settings is where we have a preconceived notion of a place that affects our behaviour in that place. For example, we all know instinctively how to behave in churches and libraries. Where we sometimes see this have an effect on how we use the workplace and how it affects performance is when we introduce things like breakout spaces and informal spaces, where we're not sure of the rules, so they tend not to get used. We're not sure whether we're allowed to sit in that space and read. Is that classed as work? Will it be frowned upon by the management? And so on. So finally, I just want to introduce you to evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychologists are interested in how our psychological processes have evolved over time for survival and well-being. And their point is that our psychological processes have basically evolved to adapt to living on the African savannah. Homo sapiens have been around for 500,000 years, but we've only actually worked in offices for just over 100 years, and our psychological processes haven't adapted to that yet. So as a hunter-gatherer, we've developed a preference for clear views out, clear vista. We like natural light and fresh air, ventilation. We prefer ambient noise levels similar to what you would find outside, rather than either noisy or too quiet environments. They point out that we're social animals. We like telling stories to each other. We gather around the watering holes or the hearth and we share food. So again, very, very social. And also we're inquisitive animals. We like to explore, we like to move around and find new things. And in contrast to that, we also require time for contemplation and solitude and just thinking and so on. So key to evolutionary psychology is our affinity to nature. We require places for contemplation and solitude. And one group of researchers have found that this can be particularly productive due to this idea of non-taxing evolutionary attention, which basically means when we're sitting in a nice landscaped environment and we're not really thinking about work, that's likely when we get that idea pop into our head. And researchers such as Browning at the Terrapin Bright Green Association have actually started to measure the impact of biophilia on productivity. So what does all this mean in terms of design principles? Well, first of all, we need a range of different places depending on personality. So the kind of spaces for collaboration that introverts prefer is going to be quite different to those of extroverts. And similarly, the design principles of offices in general will be different for different personality types. So we need to offer a choice of places for people to work. Some will want stimulating, busy and social spaces, and others will need quiet, contemplative and serene areas offering solitude. Our workplaces need to encourage social interaction, which will ultimately support collaboration, but we also need to respect privacy, and we need to design spaces so that we can control privacy and avoid distraction. So we need good team collaboration space, but we also need quiet space for solo work. And finally, drawing on the evolutionary psychology research, we need to avoid the current trend for large, deep plan, gloomy, dense, crowded and uninspiring places, and think about what people actually want and what they need that will make them more productive. So that was a bit of a canter through both productivity research and also some psychology research. Hope you found it interesting, and I'll be keen to hear your views. Thank you.